Dawn mist clung low to Arlington's slopes when Sergeant Ben Park made his first turn on the black mat, his boots clicking in perfect rhythm against the marble silence. 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat, while rows of white headstones rose behind him like an army still standing watch. The cold that morning had a precise edge, the kind that sharpened breath into visible ribbons and made every sound travel farther than it should. It carried the faint scent of wet grass, polished stone, and old winter iron from railings touched by thousands of hands. Above the tomb, the sky held that pale gray just before full sunrise, a restrained light that seemed to understand where it had arrived. No one in the plaza spoke above a whisper. A veteran in a campaign cap held his cane across both palms like a rifle at rest. Two schoolgirls in navy jackets stood shoulder to shoulder, fingers curled around souvenir programs. They had stopped reading the instant Ben stepped onto the mat. A Gold Star mother near the front kept one gloved hand over a folded photograph in her coat pocket, pressing it there with the steady pressure of memory. Ben moved as if geometry itself had taken human form. 6'2", broad across the shoulders, lean through the waist, he carried the M14 with a discipline that looked effortless only to those who had never spent years earning it. His face remained a mask carved from stone, jaw set, eyes fixed on a point beyond any single person in the crowd, beyond cameras, beyond weather, beyond the noise of ordinary life. His kepi sat exact, angle and line flawless under the dim morning light. His uniform was immaculate, in a way that seemed almost impossible to achieve outdoors in mist and wind. Every crease sharp enough to cut glass, brass catching thin sunlight like a row of small flames, white gloves pristine, trousers falling in a clean, unbroken line into boots polished to a mirror shine. He did not perform that precision for spectacle. He inhabited it as a vow. At 6:20 a.m., the first bus of visitors from a Midwestern veterans group rolled down the access road and emptied in careful silence, as if the passengers had crossed from one country into another. A father lifted his young son just high enough for the boy to see over the shoulders ahead of them. The child, no older than 8, started to ask a question and then stopped on his own, as if the cadence of those footsteps had answered it before words could. Nearby, an elderly couple, each wearing a small lapel pin from a long-ago unit, stood close enough that their coats touched. A nurse in blue scrubs, probably just off an overnight shift, steadied a man with tremors in his right hand and pointed gently toward the sentinel's measured route. 3 high school boys with phones already raised lowered them again, one after another, not out of instruction, but recognition. Some spaces did not ask for content. They asked for witness. Ben completed the lane again. Heel strike. Controlled swing. Weight transfer exact. The pause at the end of each cycle landed with ceremonial gravity, and each turn was a cut through time, so clean it seemed to divide the living from the dead and then bind them back together. To onlookers, he appeared unshakable, a monument that had stepped down from stone and chosen to breathe. Inside, his awareness moved in concentric rings, disciplined and continuous. He tracked the distance between crowd rails and the mat, counted the strollers and wheelchairs and canes, marked the small shifts in wind that could carry sound or distraction at the wrong second, and kept one part of his mind fixed where it always remained while on post. Not on himself, not on comfort, not on applause, but on those who could not stand there anymore. The tomb behind him held its own authority, severe and unadorned, marble bright even under muted dawn. The inscription, known by heart to many and newly discovered by others, lay across the stone with a weight no rhetoric could improve. Here rested honor in public view and identity in deliberate mystery. Here lay the unknowns, and because they were unnamed, they belonged to every family that had ever waited for a knock on the door, every child who grew up with one framed photograph on a mantel and one unanswered question in the house. Ben had understood that long before he earned the badge, but understanding had changed shape once he wore the uniform. Standing watch was not an assignment in his mind. It was an inheritance carried forward one measured step at a time. A faint breeze moved across the amphitheater and stirred the edge of a flag near the colonnade. It also carried a murmur from the back of the crowd, low and reverent. "Look at that discipline," the Marine with the cane said quietly, not taking his eyes off the mat. His companion answered with the voice of someone speaking in church. "That's not theater. That's duty." A schoolteacher leaned down toward her students. "Remember this part," she whispered. "Not the photos. This." No one clapped. No one cheered. The silence itself honored the place. Even the city, visible at a distance past winter branches, seemed to hold back its usual urgency for a few suspended minutes. Ben made another pass. His expression did not change. Yet deep under the stillness, where training met memory, each movement carried the imprint of years no civilian observer could read on sight. This was what most visitors never knew in full. The stillness was not passive. It was active control, forged under pressure, refined by repetition, and disciplined beyond ego. He had learned, long before Arlington, that panic moved fastest through crowds when one person at the center surrendered composure. He had also learned that calm, if genuine and unbroken, could spread just as quickly. On the mat, he offered no speech and no explanation. He offered an example, and people met it with a seriousness they did not always know they possessed. The sun began to edge above the horizon, and light slid across the marble in slow bands, turning dew to silver and casting long, clean shadows from the railings. In that widening brightness, details sharpened. The stitching at Ben's cuff, the grain of the rifle stock, the slight condensation on the breath of the gold star mother, the wedding ring on the hand she kept over the photograph in her pocket. A wheelchair user, near the left rail, adjusted a blanket over her knees and nodded to Ben each time he passed, a small gesture of respect from one form of endurance to another. He did not acknowledge with visible movement because protocol did not bend for sentiment, yet he marked her presence all the same. He marked all of them. Sentinel duty demanded awareness without display, attention without attachment, humanity without self-indulgence. By the time the church bells from a distant chapel sounded the half-hour, the crowd had thickened 3 rows deep around the viewing area, and still the hush held. A boy in a Letterman jacket leaned toward his grandfather and whispered, "How long can he do that?" The older man, voice rough with age and something heavier, replied, "As long as it takes." That answer traveled farther than either intended. Several heads turned, then settled. Ben completed another turn with exacting precision. Rifle shifted in flawless sequence, shoulders squared, chin level, gaze unwavering. His boots struck the mat with the same measured authority they had held at first light. No drift in cadence, no concession to cold, no outward sign of fatigue. He was 31 years old, but in that posture he stood for every age represented in the cemetery around him. Young men who never reached 20, officers who had crossed oceans, medics who had run toward smoke, crew chiefs, riflemen, radio operators, mechanics, pilots, names known and unknown, all folded into one unbroken tradition of watchfulness. The place had its own acoustics of reverence, footsteps on marble, breath in winter air, distant bird calls, the faint rustle of coats as people shifted weight from one foot to the other, and always that metronomic cadence at the center, steady as a heartbeat. If a stranger had arrived without context, they would have understood within seconds that this was not merely ceremony. It was covenant in motion. A nation remembered by requiring one soldier to remember out loud with his body when words would be too small. Ben reached the far edge of the mat and paused. For one measured beat, the entire scene seemed held in suspension. Mist lifting, sunlight strengthening, faces lifted toward him, white stones extending in ordered lines over the hills. Then he turned, precise and controlled, and began again. 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat, while Arlington listened and the morning gathered around the sacred rhythm of a sentinel who did not waver. The next heel strike landed, and the ritual carried forward under a sky finally brightening over Arlington, but at the edge of the plaza a duty runner had already stepped into position, waiting for the exact lawful interval to deliver a change of orders. Ben completed his pass, made the turn, and held the pause with the same unbroken discipline, while the runner stood motionless with a sealed transfer envelope pressed flat against his palm. When relief came and protocol cleared, Ben accepted the envelope, acknowledged once, and moved off the mat without ceremony, because duty did not end when the crowd stopped watching. It moved. The order inside the envelope was concise and absolute. Immediate transfer to Reagan National for a delayed, dignified movement detail, corridor security, full honors posture. Ben signed receipt, crossed the service passage behind the Memorial Amphitheater, and stepped into a waiting transport vehicle already idling with another uniformed detail. Through the window, Arlington's cold mist trailed the bus that had arrived at 6:20, and several visitors who had watched the Sentinel pacing cycle were now being guided toward the same transfer observance, quiet and attentive, as if the ceremony had simply changed location. Radio traffic built as the vehicle descended toward the river. Ground teams at the airport were reporting a compressed timeline, rerouted civilian flow, and a temporary ceremonial lane under federal control. Ben checked his gloves, weapon retention, lane protocol, and crowd containment contingencies in practice sequence while the chaplain beside him protected a manifest folder against the draft each time the rear door seal flexed. No one in the vehicle spoke more than necessary. The city was awake by the time they rolled through the secured gate, but inside that cabin the same Arlington silence held, disciplined and intentional. By the time Ben stepped under the military apron, winter light at Reagan National looked harder, more metallic, reflected off service vehicles and aircraft skin, where an emergency ceremonial transfer lane had been marked with orange barriers and armed federal police. The wind coming off the Potomac cut through wool and gloves with a narrow, deliberate bite. Ben stood at the honor corridor's edge in full dress, rifle vertical, posture exact, while ground crews rerouted traffic, and a chaplain checked manifest for a delayed, dignified movement that could not be postponed again. Even here, with jet engines whining in staggered intervals and alarms chirping from equipment racks, he looked like a fixed point in a world trying to lurch sideways. Then the ground moved. At first it was a low vibration under boot leather, subtle enough to mistake for heavy taxi traffic. 1 second later, the concrete rolled in a sharp lateral jolt that rattled jet stairs, set fuel drums chiming against their restraints, and sent a line of maintenance cones clattering across painted asphalt. A baggage tug skidded half a foot and stopped crooked. An overhead warning horn began to pulse in a flat, mechanical howl. People reached for railings, shoulders, elbows, anything steady. A mother grabbed her daughter's coat. A federal officer widened his stance and put one arm out to keep civilians back from the lane. The crowd at the perimeter froze in layers of shock. An elderly Marine with a campaign cap and cane, brought over from Arlington by shuttle for the transfer observance, planted his cane hard and stared straight ahead, jaw locked. 3 high schoolers who had been whispering over a phone lowered it and did not look away. A nurse in green scrubs wrapped an arm around a shaking veteran whose unit patch had nearly faded white with age. A father lifted his son up and held him high to keep him above the crush of shoulders and panic. A wheelchair-bound girl near the barricade, maybe 10, gloves too large for her small hands, sat rigid beside her mother as the aftershock rippled through the lane and made the chair tremble on its casters. Into that fracture of order came Damian Klein, stepping out of a black armored SUV with platinum cufflinks, flashing under security floodlights and impatience drawn sharp across his face. His convoy had been halted behind temporary barriers when the apron locked down. His driver stayed at the door. His staff hovered 2 steps behind him, eyes wide, radios hissing, afraid to touch him, and more afraid not to follow. Klein took one look at the taped honor corridor and treated it like a private inconvenience. "I'm crossing now," he snapped, voice cutting through alarms and shouted instructions. "Move this parade prop. My vehicle goes first." No one answered quickly enough for him, so he stepped into the restricted lane. A federal officer moved to intercept, but another aftershock hit, small and nasty, pitching everyone's balance just enough for Klein to surge past. He pointed at Ben with the impatient contempt of a man who believed rank could be purchased by invoice. "You heard me. Move aside." Ben did not move. The sentinel's stillness was absolute, but it was not emptiness. Behind the unreadable expression, calculations were already running. Distance from Klein to the wheelchair, wheel angle, pavement slope, nearest secured route, crowd compression points, the tempo of panic in nearby voices, the location of each armed officer now split between Quake protocol and perimeter control. He tracked every variable at once and surrendered none of his posture to the moment. Klein misread that control as weakness, and he made the mistake that drew breath out of every witness at once. He strode to the wheelchair, grabbed both handles, and dragged the girl half a yard sideways to clear space for his convoy. Her mother cried out and caught the armrest, stumbling to keep from falling. The wheels snagged on a seam in the concrete and jolted hard. The child's face went pale, then set in a stunned silence that was somehow louder than the warning horn. Around them, the crowd locked in place, outrage and disbelief traveling like an electric current through bodies held still by fear and protocol. "Sir, stop right there," one officer barked, voice cracking against the alarm. Klein did not stop. He jabbed a finger toward Ben again, almost shaking with offended entitlement. "You're a uniform and a rope line. I said move." What he did not know, what none of his frightened staff could have told him in that instant, was that the soldier he was taunting had spent years in places where the ground shook for other reasons, where one wrong movement could end a convoy, a patrol, a promise. He did not know that Ben Park's discipline had been forged long before polished brass and ceremonial cadence, and that the silence in front of him was not compliance. It was containment. Another tremor ran beneath the apron, shorter this time, but enough to make a stair truck rattle and a bank of portable lights sway. A child somewhere in the crowd began to cry and then stopped when her grandmother pulled her close. The Marine with the cane whispered one word under his breath, old and reverent and furious all at once. "Steady." Ben's eyes never left Klein's hands. The wind shifted, carrying jet fuel, cold metal, and the sharp ozone smell of stressed electrical systems. Sirens began to rise from somewhere beyond the service gate. A chaplain stood rooted near the transfer detail with one gloved hand over a folder of names, waiting for a command authority that had not yet reached the apron. 2 airport police units, nosed through the far checkpoint, lights strobing red and blue against fuselage paint. Everyone on that tarmac could feel the hinge of the moment. One arrogant civilian forcing motion. One silent sentinel holding a line that represented far more than paint and tape. Ben remained where he was, boots planted on the lane marker as if the earth itself had asked him to anchor it. To most eyes, it looked like stillness. In truth, it was the narrow edge between order and stampede, between honor and chaos, between a protected corridor for the nation's fallen and a public collapse into raw volume. The world on that apron had become noise, alarms, radios, shouting, steel clatter, wind. At its center stood one man who had not yielded 1 inch. Ben's posture never broke when the pavement rolled because the discipline beneath the ceremony had been built at cost. Onlookers saw an immaculate uniform and a man trained for ritual exactness. They did not see the deeper architecture holding that composure in place. They did not see the memory of blast pressure in the ribs, the years spent learning that fear was contagious and so was calm, or the private vow that turned every posted minute into witness rather than display. On the airport apron, those unseen layers mattered more than rank, money, or noise. 3 days before that morning at Arlington, Ben had stood inspection in sleet, with wind slicing down the hill, and never blinked once through the command sequence. 2 weeks earlier, he had spent off-duty hours at Walter Reed with a retired platoon sergeant who could no longer tie his own boots, listening more than speaking because some forms of respect were measured in presence, not speeches. By the second week of January, everyone in his chain of command knew the same fact. If a detail went unstable, Park was the sentinel they wanted in the corridor. He did not escalate. He did not posture. He did not drift. On the apron, those qualities now sat under full strain. Klein's staff began whispering in urgent fragments behind him. "Sir, federal lockout. Sir, cameras are live. Sir, please." He ignored them all, shoulders tight, chin lifted, the practiced confidence of a man used to overriding rooms by force of volume alone. A row of airport workers near the baggage carts stood motionless, gloves half-zipped, faces pale under sodium lights. A Gold Star mother who had traveled from Ohio for the transfer held her scarf to her mouth and watched Klein's hand on that wheelchair as if she were witnessing a sacrilege no law book had adequate language to describe. The father with the lifted son shifted the boy to his other arm and said quietly, "Remember this part too, the way men do when they know a lesson has arrived without warning." Ben's breathing remained controlled, precise, invisible, unless you knew how to read the subtle expansion under dress wool. His pulse had climbed, his mind had not scattered. He tracked the mother's footing, the child's posture, Klein's center of gravity, officer approach angles, and the tiny delays in response that earthquakes force into even-trained teams. In combat zones, he had learned that danger rarely announced itself in one dramatic wave. It came in compound variables, each small, each manageable, until one unchecked ego multiplied them all. Klein had become that multiplier. The child in the wheelchair finally looked up at Ben. Her eyes were wet, but steady. That gaze held for one brief second, and in it sat the entire moral equation of the scene. Power trying to shove through, duty refusing to move, witnesses deciding what kind of country they were watching in real time. A federal officer reached for his shoulder radio and called command in clipped sequence, requesting immediate authorization to detain for interference on a secured military transfer route. The response crackled back through static, partially lost under sirens and horn pulses, but one phrase landed clear enough for nearby ears. "Hold the lane. Command en route." Klein heard it. He sneered, took half a step forward anyway, and threw the insult like a challenge coin across a bar top. "Move, toy soldier. You're blocking the road." Ben did not answer. Not yet. That silence was not hesitation. It was timing. A new tremor rolled under the apron, weaker than the first, but enough to rattle suspended chains on a cargo dolly and shiver the floodlights again. The crowd compressed backward by instinct, then stopped as officers spread arms and shouted for space. The mother at the wheelchair tightened her grip. The Marine straightened as far as his spine allowed and fixed his weathered eyes on Ben with the grave recognition of one professional watching another carry weight under pressure. The nurse in scrubs kept one hand on the veteran beside her and whispered, "Stay with me, Sergeant." Though she had never met him before that minute, every strand of the scene pulled taut at once, and at the center of it, Ben Park remained locked on the lane marker, white gloves bright against rifle wood, uniform immaculate despite dust shaking loose from the apron lights, eyes tracking fault lines in both pavement and human behavior. The ground had moved. The crowd had moved. Entitlement had moved. He had not. The next second waited, heavy as iron, for the one measured choice that would decide whether that honor corridor stayed sacred or became just another road for the loudest man in the room. The next second did not break. It stretched. Wind knifed across the apron from the river, carrying jet fuel and cold rain metal and the bitter scent of overheated wiring from a light tower that had taken the last tremor badly. Red strobes from arriving units cut across the tarmac in hard pulses, then slid over faces locked in the same expression of disbelief. The honor corridor, marked by barriers and painted lines, looked suddenly less like airport infrastructure and more like a border between two moral worlds. On one side stood protocol, memory, and restraint. On the other stood urgency stripped of principle. Ben Park remained centered on that border, with the rigid exactness of a man who had trained his body to become a command before he ever opened his mouth. His kepi sat at a faultless angle despite the wind. His overcoat lay smooth across his shoulders without a single broken line, brass catching fractured light from emergency rigs. The white gloves were still pristine, stark against dark wool and walnut rifle stock, each finger aligned as if drawn with a drafting tool. Even now, with alarms blaring and people calling over each other, every crease on his uniform held sharp enough to cut glass. His boots, polished to a mirror finish at dawn, reflected flashing red and blue in clean arcs around his ankles. To the crowd, he looked motionless. In truth, he was measuring everything. The girl in the wheelchair sat half-turned from Klein's rough pull, blankets skewed, one small hand braced against the armrest as if she had decided that if the ground wanted her frightened, she would deny it the satisfaction. Her mother had recovered her footing and now stood slightly in front of her, one arm protective across the chair, chin lifted with the trembling defiance of someone whose fear had already been converted into resolve. Near them, the elderly Marine with the campaign cap had edged his cane into a crack in the concrete to steady himself and refused to look away. A nurse in green scrubs kept her palm between a veteran's shoulder blades, feeling his breath pattern the way clinicians do when panic can become collapse. A father still held his son above the crowd line, forearms shaking from the weight, but he did not lower him. 3 high schoolers stood shoulder to shoulder with their phones hanging useless at their sides, faces lit by strobes instead of screens. A Gold Star mother clutched a folded program in both hands so tightly the paper had begun to curl. Across all of them moved the same realization. No one here was watching a traffic dispute. They were witnessing a test. The aftershock faded to a low vibration, then stilled. In that temporary calm, ambient sounds returned in layers. A jet idled somewhere beyond the hangar line. A loose chain tapped rhythmically against a cargo dolly. Radio chatter snapped and clipped burst from officers' shoulders. Someone cried once and was soothed. Someone prayed under his breath. Klein's driver called his name and got no answer. His staff hovered behind him, polished shoes planted in dirty slush, expensive coats open to the cold because none of them had remembered to zip them. Entitlement had brought them onto that lane. Fear had arrived with no invitation. Ben watched Klein's hands, then shoulders, then hips, reading intent in sequence. He tracked the lane as if it were still the black mat at Arlington, measured and inviolable. And because his mind worked that way under stress, two landscapes occupied him at once. This rattled apron, with its lights and barriers and rolling alarms, and the hill above the Potomac where the marble tomb sat under morning mist like a vow cast in stone. Arlington at dawn had not smelled like panic. It had smelled like wet grass, cold stone, and the faint copper of winter railings. The wind there had moved softly, through bare branches and over rows of white markers aligned with a precision that humbled anyone who saw them long enough. The amphitheater steps held old silence in their seams. The air tasted clean enough to make breath feel earned. When Ben had taken post that morning, the light was pearl gray, and each step had sounded distinct. Heel, roll, set, the cadence crisp against marble, 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat. A crowd had watched with reverence, but reverence was not passive. He had seen it in details most people missed. There had been the Marine with weathered hands wrapped around a cane, posture still unconsciously squared when the rifle shifted shoulders. The two schoolgirls who stopped whispering mid-sentence and mirrored his pause without realizing it. The nurse in blue scrubs, likely ending a night shift, who stood with tired eyes and full attention anyway. The father who lifted his boy and whispered explanations, too quiet to hear, teaching lineage in real time. The elderly couple with veteran pins and interlaced fingers. The woman in the wheelchair who nodded each time Ben passed. A silent exchange between disciplines of endurance. Even the high school boys, restless at first, had lowered their phones and held still as if the ceremony had reached through noise and put a hand on their shoulders. He remembered the exact weight of the M14 in those pre-dawn minutes, the balance point against the gloved palm, the minute tension in forearm tendons during each transition. He remembered the collar sitting clean against his neck, the kepi brim framing his sightline, the way polished brass warmed by a degree once the first sun reached it. He remembered how the tomb's inscription seemed to gather quiet around itself and return it amplified, how the stones beyond rolled down the hillside in ordered testimony, how the entire place insisted that memory was an active duty, never a mood. That discipline was why he was standing here now on cracked airport pavement instead of marble, holding an honor lane through a seismic event, with a civilian challenger 3 feet away, and a child he had to protect without breaking control. The setting had changed. The standard had not. By the winter he turned 31, Ben Park had already lived 3 military lifetimes in the span most people used to build one civilian resume. 2 Afghanistan tours had carved his first understanding of controlled fear. The first was in Kunar, where mountain roads narrowed into cliff edges, and silence often meant planning, not peace. The second was in Helmand, where dust got into optics, lungs, and thoughts, and every patrol brief ended with names spoken slowly because names might be all a family received. His Syria deployment came later, a different terrain, different language, same arithmetic of risk, route, distance, cover, civilian presence, extraction windows, and the burden of deciding in seconds with consequences that lasted years. He did not talk about decorations in public and never on duty, but his chain of command knew why the Bronze Star with Valor sat in a case he kept closed. It had come after a convoy strike where a secondary blast had hit close enough to turn daylight into white pressure and throw him against broken concrete. The shrapnel scar under his left rib was narrow, pale now, almost elegant if you did not know what had made it. He felt it in cold weather and during storms, a tightness that reminded him the body keeps records even when the mind tries to file them away. Medics patched him. He returned. That was the simple version. The real version included names. The heaviest one was Specialist Nate Hollis. Nate had been the loudest grin in any staging area. A Georgia kid with a crooked nose from a high school football and a talent for finding humor in rations no one should have called food. He could field strip his weapon in darkness, quote entire sections of old action movies with perfect timing, and talk anyone through a bad hour without making it sound like therapy. Before one winter movement, hunched over cold chow that had gone rubbery in 10 minutes, Nate had lifted a plastic fork like it was fine silver and said, "If I make it home, I'm never running again unless it's toward pancakes." Half the squad laughed. Ben had laughed too. One short breath through a mouthful of coffee gone bitter from sitting too long on a heater coil. That line would stay with him longer than many firefights. The pressure plate took Nate on a road that had looked clean at first pass and was not. There was no cinematic warning, no dramatic countdown, no heroic speech. Just one wrong weight on one hidden trigger, and the world split into noise, dust, shouted commands, and aftermath. Ben remembered the exact position of the sun when they secured the area, the grit in his teeth, the way his hands kept working even as his thoughts tried to refuse what had happened. He remembered the silence in the transport later, helmets bowed, nobody pretending language could improve the truth. He remembered writing the first line of what would become a letter and deleting it 3 times because no sentence deserved to begin that message. Some losses scar tissue, others become architecture. For Ben, Nate's unfinished joke became a permanent measure of what duty meant after combat. Not abstract patriotism, not recruitment slogans. Duty became this: the living carrying what the dead could no longer carry, without complaint and without performance. When his tours ended and assignment options opened, he did not choose the old guard for prestige. He chose it because the tomb of the unknown soldier represented the most honest contract he knew between sacrifice and memory. Unknown by name, known by cost. Present in stone, absent at every family table that had set one place too many and then one too few. He sought the badge not to be seen, but to stand where witness was mandatory and ego had no oxygen. Training for the tomb did not tolerate approximation. Uniform prep alone was ritual and discipline braided together. Seams set and checked, brass aligned to exact standards, fabric brushed until no lint remained, gloves inspected, shoes worked to reflective finish by hand, kepi angle corrected to the degree. Then came movement, cadence, rifle manual. Turns executed until muscle and intent became indivisible. Endurance under weather, under scrutiny, under monotony, under emotion. Composure as a practiced skill, not a personality trait. He embraced all of it because precision gave grief a place to go. Now, with Klein glowering in front of him, and the child's wheelchair still skewed from that careless grab, every one of those years converged. Ben's pulse was elevated. His breathing remained silent. His gaze stayed level. The scar under his left rib tightened with the cold, and he filed the sensation away as data, nothing more. Around him, the apron waited for someone to blink first. He did not. The Marine by the cane drew in a careful breath and said, barely audible, "Hold that line, Sergeant." Ben heard him. He did not acknowledge. His focus remained on the man with platinum cufflinks and shaking restraint, on the mother with her arm locked over the chair, on the narrow lane representing far more than paint and temporary barriers. He had walked 21 steps at sunrise over marble built for remembrance. He was standing those same steps in his mind now over fractured concrete. Same vow, different ground. A siren rose nearer at the service gate, joined by another, then a third. Command was closing the distance. Cameras from 2 local crews on the far perimeter had swung toward the corridor, lenses searching for the center of the scene, and finding it instantly. 1 sentinel, 1 line, 1 nation's memory compressed into a single, unresolved second. Ben remained a fixed point in the noise, shoulders square, rifle steady, white glove bright against dark steel, carrying in silence the weight of Nate Hollis's unfinished laugh and every unknown name carved into the mission he had sworn to guard. Sirens rose at the service gate, and every camera on the far perimeter found the same frame. Damian Klein in a charcoal overcoat, open to the wind, platinum cufflinks bright as signal flares, one hand still near the wheelchair he had yanked out of his path, and Sergeant Ben Park standing between him and the honor corridor like a door cut from stone. Klein had spent 20 years teaching institutions to bend around him. He had started as a charter broker with 1 leased jet and a borrowed office, then built a private aviation empire by moving cargo and executives through weather, strikes, and shutdowns that stranded everyone else. He was sharp, tireless, and ruthlessly efficient, and those traits had made him wealthy enough to put his name on hospital wings and emergency grant announcements. In every public profile, he was described as decisive. In every room he entered, people moved before he finished his sentence. Over time, that reflex around him hardened into doctrine. If Damian Klein wanted a path cleared, someone cleared it. He had donated heavily after hurricanes, wildfires, and infrastructure failures, and each donation had brought him closer to command tables where he had never worn a uniform, but had learned to speak like a man who thought operational authority came with the check. The habit followed him into airports, municipal briefings, and federal lobbies. Rules became suggestions. Security lanes became negotiations. Delay became insult. Staff learned to translate his temper into euphemisms before press microphones reached him. He called it urgency. Everyone around him called it managing the boss. On that apron, during active earthquake protocol, he read the honor corridor exactly the way he read every barrier in his world. Temporary, inconvenient, and ultimately negotiable. The wind drove sleet-fine grit across painted concrete. Floodlights trembled overhead, and a warning horn pulsed in a flat, metallic rhythm. Klein's convoy idled 20 yards back, matte black vehicles with government-adjacent permits and private credentials hanging from dashboards. His security driver stood by the lead SUV, one hand on the open door, waiting for the command to lurch forward. Behind Klein, 2 staff members hovered with tablets clutched to their chests, eyes flicking from federal officers to cameras to their employers' shoulders, tracking danger by posture. "Sir, command has the lane locked," one of them whispered, voice thin. Klein did not turn. "Then, command can unlock it." He jabbed a finger toward Ben again, cufflink catching a red strobe. "You, move." Ben remained still, gaze level, rifle aligned in formal carry, white gloves unmarked by the grit now skittering over the tarmac. That refusal, calm and unadorned, infuriated Klein more than argument could have. He was accustomed to resistance expressed through words because words could be overrun. Silence offered no purchase. He took 1 step closer, then another, until the polished toe of his shoe crossed the painted edge of the restricted lane. From the perimeter line, a federal airport officer raised his voice over the horn and sirens. "Sir, back behind the barrier now." Klein cut him off without looking. "I have federal emergency contracts and a live logistics corridor waiting on that vehicle. I am not standing in a parking lot while ceremonial traffic blocks response." The claim was only half true, and half-truth was his preferred weapon. He did have contracts. He did move supplies in crises. But this lane, at this minute, carried a military transfer under emergency protection. He knew just enough to invoke authority and not enough to recognize where his authority ended. The mother beside the wheelchair tightened her grip on the push handle he had manhandled seconds earlier. Her knuckles were white in the flashing light. The girl in the chair looked from Klein to Ben, breath quick, chin raised despite the tremor still running through her shoulders. Klein saw her fear and misread it as leverage. He angled his body toward the mother and spoke as if granting a favor. "Ma'am, I'm clearing you out of danger. Stand aside." She shook her head once. "Don't touch her again." For a fraction of a second, he looked genuinely surprised that she had answered him in that tone. Then the surprise burned into contempt. "You're in an active zone," he snapped. "I'm trying to move assets." From the edge of the crowd, the Marine with the campaign cap answered in a voice rough as gravel. "That child isn't your asset." Heads turned. The crowd had been stunned into silence, but now whispers moved through them in small, sharp currents. He grabbed her chair. "During honors? Who does that?" 3 high schoolers stood rigid, phones forgotten at their sides. A nurse kept her palm steady on the shaking veteran's back. The father, still holding his son, adjusted his stance and said quietly, "Watch the soldier, not the shouting." At 7:14 a.m., the tower clock above the service terminal clicked to the next minute, and a new aftershock rolled under the apron, subtle but undeniable. Metal stairs rattled. A baggage cart chain chimed against steel. People flinched. Ben did not. Klein spread his hands in a theatrical display of disbelief, speaking now for cameras as much as for the officers. "You're all watching this. In an earthquake, and this toy soldier is blocking emergency movement." He said toy soldier with a smirk he had likely used in boardrooms when dismissing anyone who wore ceremony instead of a suit. The phrase landed across the lane like a slap. Ben's expression did not shift. The line of his jaw remained set. His eyes stayed on Klein's center mass, then flicked once to the wheelchair, once to the mother's footing, once to the nearest officer's containment angle. Internally, his mind ran a disciplined decomposition of risk: civilian density, tremor probability, lateral escape routes, aggressor momentum, protected person stability, command-response interval. Combat had taught him that chaos was never one problem. It was a stack of problems competing for the same second. Tomb training had taught him which part of himself to show while solving that stack. None of it. Klein mistook that restraint for fragility and leaned in 1 inch too far. "You're ceremonial. I'm operational. Get out of my road." The fatal assumption stood naked in the air. He believed pageantry and duty were opposite things. He believed stillness meant passivity. He believed loud certainty outweighed earned command. Around him, his own staff finally looked less afraid of his anger than of the consequences converging on him. One officer keyed his shoulder radio again. "Apron command. Subject is non-compliant and interfering with military transfer route. Request expedited. Command authority unseen." Static snapped, then a clear reply. "Authority inbound. Hold position. Do not cede corridor." The sentence traveled through nearby bodies like an electric signal. Klein heard it, and his mouth tightened. For the first time, calculation appeared behind his eyes. He was good at measuring rooms, and this room had changed. Officers were no longer asking. Cameras were no longer incidental. Witnesses were no longer passive. Yet habit drove him forward anyway. He lifted his chin toward Ben. "Last warning. Move." Ben did not answer. He did not need to. The corridor itself answered through him. Seconds stretched and thickened, each one carrying too much weight. The warning horn kept pulsing. Red-blue light washed over polished boots, then over platinum cufflinks, then over the little girl's blanket. A plane engine whined in the near distance like a held breath. The crowd froze into a single shared posture. Dozens of people unconsciously leaning toward the same axis, waiting for the exact point where authority would become action. Inside Ben, every instinct was live. His pulse sat high but controlled, his breathing shallow and precise, to preserve verbal clarity if command speech became necessary. He felt the old scar under his left rib tighten with the cold and filed it away without emotion. He sensed micro-movements in Klein's shoulders that telegraphed surge or retreat. He tracked the mother's trembling knees and the angle of the wheelchair casters on uneven pavement. He marked the father's lifted son, the Marine's planted cane, the nurse anchoring the veteran, the officers widening their stance against another possible tremor. His awareness moved in rings, from immediate threat to crowd dynamics to institutional chain, a lattice of attention built over years where missing one detail could cost lives. Externally, he remained the same disciplined silhouette the crowd had seen at Arlington before dawn. Overcoat smooth, brass aligned, kepi exact, rifle steady, white gloves pristine. That visual continuity mattered. In panic, people searched for a stable reference point. Ben understood this at the level of reflex. If he looked unbroken, the perimeter held. If the perimeter held, civilians stayed contained. If civilians stayed contained, the protected lane remained viable for the fallen and the living alike. Klein shifted his weight onto his front foot, testing whether proximity itself could force capitulation. Ben read it instantly. Not aggression yet. Pressure. Dominance theater. The kind men used when they expected institutions to flinch first. A child near the back began crying, then quieted when her grandmother wrapped both arms around her and whispered, "Look at the guard, honey. Look at him." The grandmother's instruction passed down the crowd like doctrine. Eyes moved to Ben. Even those who had arrived as bystanders now understood they were witnesses to a standard, not a personality conflict. Another minor tremor ticked through the concrete, enough to make a portable light shiver but not fail. Officers called for everyone to hold where they were. No one advanced, no one scattered. The frozen crowd became an instrument of order by obeying the one man who had not yielded an inch. Klein's driver took 2 hesitant steps forward from the SUV, then stopped when an officer from the perimeter threw up a palm and barked, "Stay with your vehicle." The driver retreated. Behind him, one of Klein's staff quietly removed a company credential lanyard and tucked it into her coat pocket, a small instinctive act of self-preservation in front of cameras that were still recording every second. Ben heard, rather than saw, the approach of heavier command vehicles at the gate. Deeper engine notes, tighter braking discipline, synchronized door impacts. Authority was closing distance, but it was not here yet. Until it arrived, he was the line. Klein seemed to sense the narrowing window and made one last push, voice rising, composure cracking at the edges. "I said move, toy soldier. You're blocking the road." This time Ben remained silent, posture unchanged, formal bearing locked so completely that the refusal carried without a single spoken word. The Marine exhaled through his nose like a man hearing discipline hold under fire. The mother beside the wheelchair straightened. The girl lifted her chin another inch. Klein stared at Ben as if seeing him clearly for the first time, not as costume, not as obstacle, but as command. He did not step back. Not yet. But the certainty in his face fractured. The apron held in suspended tension, one tremor away from renewed panic, and one decision away from resolution. Ben stayed rooted on the lane marker, every muscle coiled behind ceremonial stillness, eyes fixed, mind exact, carrying the corridor, the crowd, and the nation's dead through the longest minute of the morning, while the next decisive movement gathered like thunder just beyond the line. Thunder arrived in the form of discipline. Ben moved one step. It was not a lunge, not a shove, not a break in bearing born from anger. It was one measured step forward, heel setting down on fractured apron concrete with the same calibrated force he had used on Arlington. Marble at dawn, the same geometry, the same vow translated onto shaking ground. His rifle came down in a controlled arc, butt planted between Damian Klein and the wheelchair with a crack that cut through horn pulses, sirens, static, and wind as if the entire morning had been waiting for exactly that sound. The crowd inhaled as one body. Ben's left hand rose, white glove bright under strobes, palm outward in command halt. His face remained unreadable, jaw set, eyes fixed past Klein's anger, and into the line of risk still running through the lane. When he spoke, his voice carried informal cadence, low and level, without strain, without heat, each word placed with the authority of doctrine. This corridor carries the nation's fallen. You will stand down. No one answered. For a suspended beat, even the warning horn seemed farther away. Klein froze with his front foot still loaded to surge, mouth half open around the next insult that never came. The sentence had landed harder than volume because it gave the lane a meaning no camera could edit and no contract could override. Around him, his staff stopped pretending they could manage optics. One lowered her tablet. Another took 2 steps back from him, then stopped with both hands visible at chest level as officers shifted positions. The mother at the wheelchair held still, eyes locked on Ben's raised hand, then on the rifle butt anchored like a boundary marker, driven into bedrock. Her breathing slowed by degrees. The girl beside her, cheeks pale from shock, looked up at Ben with a gaze that had moved beyond fear into recognition. She had just watched a stranger place himself between power and harm, without spectacle, without hesitation, and without touching her once. A second aftershock ticked under the concrete, light and quick, vibrating through cargo chains and wheel chocks. People flinched. Ben did not. The hand stayed up, the rifle stayed planted, the lane stayed closed. Klein found his voice and tried to recover it with contempt. You don't command me. Ben gave him nothing except the same level stare and the same vertical palm. Internally, every channel remained active. Klein's shoulders tight and unstable, mother's footing improving, wheelchair casters now straight, officers closing at 2 angles, crowd compression easing by inches because panic had lost its center. Years of route clearance drills, convoy contacts, and ceremonial precision converged into one conclusion he had already enforced. Hold. Do not escalate. Do not yield. From the perimeter, someone whispered. He stopped him. Another voice answered, trembling with awe. With one sentence. The Marine with the campaign cap tightened his grip on his cane and nodded once, like a man witnessing a standard upheld in the exact way he had hoped his country still could. The father, holding his son, shifted the boy down to his shoulder at last, both of them watching in silence. The nurse in scrubs checked the veteran's pulse at the wrist, then kept her hand there, eyes wet and steady. 3 teenagers who had come for footage stood with phones at their sides. No one recording now because the moment had already carved itself into memory. Klein tried one more step. Ben's rifle did not move, but the angle of the barrel changed by a fraction. Legal and unmistakable, reinforcing the barrier without touching him. The white glove remained raised. The command remained in effect. "Stand down, sir," Ben said one final time. The title was deliberate. It gave Klein the dignity of a lawful choice, even now. Klein did not take it. He jabbed a finger toward Ben's chest, stopping short of contact. "You're a parade boy with a costume rifle." The words sounded thin in the frozen lane. They also sounded late. Consequence was already on approach. Exactly 1 minute after Ben's command line, twin black command SUVs and a marked Federal Airport Police unit cut through the service gate in synchronized entry, tires hissing over wet concrete, lights strobing across fuselage metal, and faces turned toward the corridor. Doors opened in sequence. A lieutenant colonel stepped out first, scanned once, and pivoted to clear space. Then Lieutenant General Marcus Whitaker came into view, overcoat buttoned high against the wind, 4 stars catching red-blue flashes with cold precision. The effect on the apron was immediate. Officers straightened. Radios went quiet mid-sentence. Even civilians who did not recognize him felt authority settle over the scene like a weighted blanket on shaking shoulders. Whitaker crossed the lane at a controlled pace, boots deliberate, gaze taking in all critical points in one sweep. The displaced wheelchair now stabilized by the mother, Klein in violation position, Ben holding the corridor, crowd contained, transfer route uncompromised. He stopped 2 feet behind Ben's shoulder. "Sergeant Park," he said, voice formal and clear. "Report." Ben did not lower his hand until the general finished speaking. Then the white glove came down in one crisp motion to his side. Rifle remained grounded between Klein and the wheelchair. "Sir," Ben replied. Civilian subject breached restricted honor corridor during earthquake protocol, made physical contact with protected civilian in wheelchair, refused repeated lawful commands to withdraw, and attempted forced passage of private convoy through active military transfer lane. Corridor remains secure. Whitaker held his eyes on Klein as the report ended. "Confirmed," he said, each syllable clipped. He turned slightly toward the federal officer nearest him. Record that statement as primary field account." The officer nodded and repeated into his body mic, voice suddenly precise. "Primary field account logged. Sergeant Benjamin Park, on-scene command sentinel." Klein tried to interject with practiced indignation. "General, this is a misunderstanding. I have emergency movement authority," and Whitaker cut him off without raising volume. "No, Mr. Klein. You had access in designated zones. You do not have authority over this lane, this protocol, or this soldier." He stepped 1 pace closer, enough that Klein had to choose between holding eye contact and glancing away. "You interfered with a protected military transfer route during seismic emergency response. You ignored federal directives. You physically displaced a civilian child in restricted space." The words hit harder than accusation because they were procedural, not theatrical. They left no room to negotiate identity into innocence. "I was preventing a bottleneck," Klein said, but his cadence had thinned. "You were creating one," Whitaker answered, "and you were told to stand down." A federal police sergeant moved to Klein's flank. "Sir, place your hands where I can see them." Klein looked at his staff, searching for rescue in faces that had already retreated into compliance. None spoke. One of them quietly handed over a badge wallet to an agent before being asked. Another lifted both palms and stepped back from the lane marker, eyes down. Whitaker extended his hand toward an arriving security administrator who had hustled in behind the police unit with a tablet and printed credential sheet. His apron credentials. The administrator swallowed, then nodded. Suspended, effective immediately, sir. Corporate convoy clearance revoked pending federal review. State it clearly, Whitaker said. The administrator turned toward Klein and, with visible effort, spoke into the open space where cameras and witnesses could hear. Mr. Damian Klein, your access credentials for all secured airport aprons are suspended on scene. Your convoy will be escorted out after processing. Silence broke into scattered gasps, then settled again. Klein's jaw worked once. Do you have any idea who funds half the emergency flights through this region? Whitaker's expression did not change. Today you learned the difference between funding operations and commanding honor. The federal sergeant repeated, firmer now. Hands visible, sir. Klein complied this time. No struggle. No shove. Officers secured his wrists with standard restraints and guided him 3 steps back from the corridor, then turned him toward the processing vehicle. The movement was controlled, professional, and public. Cameras captured everything. So did the crowd. As Klein passed the wheelchair, he looked once at the mother, as if expecting either apology or fury to meet him halfway. She gave him neither. She simply shifted her body between him and her daughter and kept her eyes on Ben. Whitaker watched Klein transferred to federal custody, then signaled to an aide. Ensure witness statements from the mother, the perimeter officer, and the medical staff member in green scrubs. Pull fixed camera feeds from this apron, gate approach, and lane center. Chain of custody starts now. Yes, sir. The thread of evidence that had been hanging in radio static all morning snapped into order. Body cam captures were tagged. Gate logs were preserved. Credential revocation was entered with timestamp. The officer who had first called command received formal acknowledgement on channel. Hold the lane directive validated. Good call. He exhaled like a man who had been carrying a brick in his chest. Whitaker turned back to Ben. Around them, the crowd stayed respectfully silent, sensing this was not a victory lap, but institutional truth being spoken into record. Sergeant Park, the general said loud enough for witnesses and cameras, your command was lawful, measured, and exactly right. You protected civilians, preserved the transfer route, and upheld protocol under seismic stress. The United States Army recognizes that. Ben's reply was immediate. Thank you, sir. No smile, no flourish, just acknowledgement. Whitaker's gaze softened by a degree as he glanced toward the girl in the wheelchair. Check on them. Ben gave one crisp nod. Yes, sir. He lifted the rifle from its planted point in a smooth recovery motion and returned to formal carry, then pivoted toward the mother and daughter with the same controlled precision he had used to stop Klein. He halted at respectful distance, postures squared but non-threatening. Ma'am, he said, are you and your daughter injured? The mother shook her head, breath unsteady but stronger now. Shaken. Not hurt. Ben lowered his chin once in acknowledgement. Medical can evaluate if you wish. You are secure here. The girl looked at his white gloves, then at his face. Her small hand rose in a trembling salute that was not textbook and did not need to be. It was brave, and it was enough to silence the entire apron again. Ben returned the salute with exact military form, sharp and brief, then dropped his hand. Behind him, officers began reopening non-essential lanes in controlled sequence while keeping the honor corridor locked. The warning horn finally cut out. Wind still moved hard across the concrete, and the earth might yet tremble again, but panic had drained from the crowd. In its place stood something steadier, relief braided with reverence. Whitaker gave final directives to his team and stepped aside so the transfer protocol could continue. Federal police escorted Klein out of frame toward processing, his convoy idling useless behind barriers he could no longer cross. His staff followed under supervision, stripped of swagger, carrying clipboards in silence. At the center of the apron, Sergeant Ben Park resumed his post on the lane marker, rifle steady, shoulders squared, eyes forward, holding sacred ground on ordinary concrete, while the nation's chain of command affirmed what everyone present had just witnessed. When the earth moved and noise tried to rule, duty held the line. The lane stayed locked while the transfer detail moved, and the noise on the apron finally shifted from panic to procedure. The chaplain stepped forward with the manifest folder, still pressed flat to his chest, its corners bent from the tremors, but the pages inside dry and intact, then handed it to the operations captain for verification under portable floodlight. Names were checked aloud in low cadence, each line answered and confirmed. The honor team advanced in measured sequence, and every civilian on the perimeter lowered their voices as the movement crossed the corridor Ben had held. 10 minutes later, with the transfer complete and the route sealed, the federal evidence officer began the accountability cycle exactly as Whitaker had ordered. Body cam files were uploaded from 3 officers to a field terminal on the hood of a cruiser, each clip tagged with time, position, and officer ID gate logs were exported and copied to 2 encrypted drives, one for airport command, one for federal investigators. The apron camera feed from Lane Center was pulled and checksum verified in front of witnesses. The credential suspension for Damian Klein and his convoy was entered into the access system while the administrator read the entry aloud for the record, then printed and signed the revocation sheet. Ben stood at formal rest while statements were taken, his gloves still white, except for a gray dust trace along the knuckles from the quake grit. The perimeter officer who had made the first hold the lane call repeated the timeline without embellishment. The nurse in green scrubs gave her witness account in a voice that trembled once and then steadied. The mother of the girl confirmed the physical grab on the wheelchair handles and identified the exact point where the chair had snagged on the concrete seam. Even Klein's driver, shoulders slumped and tie loose, admitted he had warned his principal the lane was locked before Klein pushed through. One of Klein's senior staff members, the woman who had hidden her lanyard, asked to amend her initial report. She looked once toward the processing vehicle, then back to the agent and said, "He told us, if they won't move, move them." Those were his words. She signed beneath that sentence and stepped away. The loaded glance she had given earlier finally resolved into testimony. A maintenance chief arrived with 2 technicians to inspect the light tower that had sparked and swayed during the worst tremor. They shut power, opened the panel, and logged a melted relay with burn odor consistent with the ozone smell people had noticed when the ground first rolled. The loose cargo chain that had chimed through each aftershock was secured with a secondary lock and photographed for the event record because the sound had marked the timing of tremors on several statements. Nothing was left as rumor. Each strange detail was either documented or dismissed with reason. At 8:03 a.m., a call came over CommandNet from the federal duty prosecutor. Interference and emergency lane obstruction charges were accepted for booking review, supported by video, officer accounts, and civilian statements. Whitaker listened, gave one clipped acknowledgement, and handed the radio back. No one cheered. The victory on that apron was not punishment, it was restored order. He turned to the small knot of civilians nearest the barrier, voice lowered so it carried only a few yards. "Some people think authority is volume," he said. "Authority is restraint in service of duty. Remember what you saw." The Marine with the cane answered with a quiet, "Yes, General," and removed his cap for one brief second before settling it back on his head. When formal release came, Ben walked with the mother and daughter to the medical tent that had been set by the service gate. He did not hover and did not rush them. Inside, a flight medic checked the girl's pulse, pupils, and shoulder range where the chair had jolted, then cleared her with no injury and documented mild shock only. The mother signed the care note, thanked the medic, and looked up at Ben as if searching for language large enough to hold the morning. She found a simple one. "You saw her first." Ben gave a single nod. "I saw the lane, ma'am. She was in it." The girl sat straighter in her wheelchair now, blanket retucked, breath no longer shaking. "Mom said you guard soldiers," she said. Ben's expression stayed formal, but his tone softened by a degree. "I stand watch for them, and for the living who come to honor them." By late afternoon, after debrief at Fort Myer and uniform reset, he rode back through the Arlington gate in the fading blue of winter light. The debrief had been as exacting as any field action. His statement dictated and transcribed, reviewed line by line, then signed. The chaplain's manifest receipt logged as complete. The corridor command recording archived with the incident file. All temporary evidence drives placed in tamper bags and transferred to federal custody under signature chain. The perimeter officer received formal commendation notation in the preliminary report for early containment call. Nothing remained floating. Every thread was tied to a page, a name, and a timestamp. The air at the cemetery felt colder by dusk, cleaner too, as if the river wind had swept the day's fuel and siren residue out of his lungs. White headstones climbed the darkening hills in ordered rows, turning silver under floodlights. The flag near the amphitheater snapped once, then settled into a steady ripple. Visitors had thinned, but not vanished. A final crowd gathered in respectful quiet for evening watch. Elderly couples in heavy coats, two teenagers standing with hands out of their pockets for once, a father and son side by side, the nurse from the apron still in scrubs beneath a borrowed jacket, and the Marine with a cane planted squarely at the rail. Near him waited the mother and her daughter. They had come up from the city before sunset, driven by a need the day itself had created. The girl wore a small knit cap now and held the edge of her blanket with both hands, no longer from fear, just from cold. When Ben emerged for post, immaculate again, every line restored, she drew in a breath that fogged the air and squared her shoulders the way children do when imitating courage they have just witnessed. Inspection lights traced his uniform in pale bands, kepi exact, brass aligned, white gloves pristine, rifle wood polished deep, boots dark as glass. If fatigue sat anywhere in him, it did not breach the surface. He stepped onto the black mat. His boots clicked in perfect rhythm. 21 steps. Pause. Turn. Repeat. The sound traveled across marble and into the crowd's silence like a metronome for memory. No alarms now, no horns, no radio crackle. Only cadence, breath, wind, and the low rustle of coats. The Marine watched with wet eyes and a jaw set hard against emotion, while the nurse folded her hands and bowed her head. The father leaned down to whisper something to his son, and this time the boy did not ask a question. He simply watched. On Ben's third pass, the girl raised her hand in a careful salute, elbow too high, fingers imperfect. Determination flawless. Protocol kept his gaze fixed forward while on the mat, but as he reached the turn point and pivoted, he allowed the smallest lawful acknowledgement, a fractional chin set, almost imperceptible unless you were waiting for it. She saw it. Her mother saw it too, and the woman pressed her lips together as tears found her anyway. The Marine bent toward the girl and spoke softly, old gravel voice gentled by respect. "That's what steady looks like." She kept her hand up until Ben completed the cycle, then lowered it with ceremony of her own. As darkness deepened, the crowd thinned further, but no one left abruptly. People stepped back the way they step out of chapels, reluctant to break what had been restored. At the rail, the mother touched the girl's shoulder and said, "Ready?" The girl nodded, then looked once more at Ben, pacing under the floodlights, and whispered, "Thank you, Sergeant Park," though he was already at the far end of the mat and could not officially reply. He answered the only way his post allowed. 21 steps. Pause. Turn. Repeat. Up the hill and out into the cemetery, white stones held their endless ranks under the winter sky. The flag moved in slow, deliberate arcs. Marble carried each measured footfall with clean authority. And at the center of that sacred geometry, where the nation kept faith with names known and unknown, Sergeant Ben Park stood his watch and did not waver.